Hello everybody, welcome back. On the last video I was attempting to get the rings unstuck on this engine from a Ryobi BP42 Backpack blower. I was not successful. One of the rings broke when I was trying to take it off. One of them came out pretty nicely. If I do this again, I will probably let the pistons soak in a parts cleaner and see if they'll loosen up. But in the meantime, you can't buy just the rings, so I have to replace the entire short block assembly, which is right here. I got it from jacksmallengines.com for about $75, including shipping. Step one of this reassembly is to loosen up this bolt here, and then remove the flywheel and the blower adapter from the bottom of this old engine. And I'm going to do that by tapping on this nut with a punch, and hopefully that will jiggle it loose enough that I can pop this right off, and same on the other side with the adapter. Alright, I tapped the center of the crank with a punch a couple of times and it wasn't coming loose. I didn't want to slip and destroy anything because I need that flywheel and Magneto to be in good shape. So I got my puller on it and I'm going to give that a shot. I imagine it'll come right off. And I'll do the same on the other side for the adapter. I tried my puller and I didn't have any luck for whatever reason. Again, I was just getting too worried that I would break something because the puller was starting to get a little sideways and the flywheel wasn't moving. So what I wound up doing was just making sure the nut was off of here. I put a screwdriver in my vise. I put this right on here, like that. Put the center of the screwdriver right in the divot. And I just tapped on both sides of this very lightly and it popped right off like so. So you can see that there is a keyway here that goes on, so this this Magneto and flywheel can only go on one way. And I'm going to do the same thing to the other side to get this adapter off. Once again, that method was successful, so I can now take this. There's my adapter, and I'm going to take the screwdriver out of the vise before I lean over and take out 9. Next thing I'm going to do is remove this heat dam that goes between the carburetor and the engine with a couple of Torx screws. And I'll also get this old gasket to reinstall on the new engine block. And now I'm going to reinstall it directly onto the intake side of the new block. Now that the heat dam is bolted on, I can go to the keyed shaft over here on the engine and I can reattach the flywheel and Magneto assembly. So I'll put on the flywheel, the washer, and then bolt it down. Now that that is bolted loosely on there, I'm going to flip it over and I'll put the adapter on the other side. And I'll tighten this bolt all the way down later, because right now if I spin it, it just turns the whole shaft. So once I get the fan assembly back onto this adapter, I'll have something to grab onto and I can tighten this down good. Just something to note, the adapter bolt here is reverse thread, so you have to turn it left, so it's lefty-tighty. And now we get to put the engine back into the machine. So here's my 2/2 of the little snail shell assembly here. This is the coil already attached. There's the fuel, the throttle line. Now I'm going to place the engine in here the only way that it will fit in there. Once you have the engine slid into its place, if you look at the bottom side of this snail shell here, sorry, this isn't very bright, but there is a screw that goes in right here. See that? Let's see if we can see that a little better. And anyway, that screws right into the head of the engine. Now the engine screws to the remainder of the assembly using these silver screws here. And they go right into, let me see. Try to get a good view of this for you. Right on these little ears. There's a hole here and a hole here, and then 2 on the other side right underneath this coil. Cable. Okay, I have the engine bolted in with those 4 bolts, Now the bolt that goes into the head from underneath on this new engine, the place where it was supposed to actually thread into the engine, for some reason wasn't threaded. I don't know why. So in any case, there's now no longer a screw holding the head of the engine down. So, but it feels like these 4 should be sufficient. I'm not about to try to rethread this just because I'm not an expert on that, and I really don't want to crack a brand new block. Now, in order to properly set the space between the coil and the Magneto, I'm going to put a business card in between here like this, and then roll the Magneto over the magnetic part of it until it's completely lined up. And that should give me about the right space, and then I'll tighten these 2 bolts back down on the coil. And that should keep it in its place, and I should be able to spin this and only have about a business card's width between any of the coil pieces and the Magneto. Okay, so now everything's tightened up and I can spin this and the magnet will just brush right by the coil without quite touching it. That's exactly what you want. Now I flipped the half of the snail shell with the engine over, and I'm going to put the blower on. It just lines up with the 3 holes on there. And then they hold in place with these little silver Allen wrench screws. And now with this fan in place, you have something to grab onto so you can kind of retorque the bottom bolt on the engine and the top bolt that holds the flywheel on, just to make sure they're good and snug. Okay, now I've put the 2 halves of the snail shell back together, and I'm going to put the screws in. They go in the bottom, so there's a bunch of little screws here. And then it will all be one piece again. And now I'm going to put the exhaust back on. The little tailpipe goes into this hole, and then these 2 holes line up with these, and these 2 Allen wrench nuts here hold it all together. Hey, just a quick note, I did have to loosen this little engine mount bolt here because this little exhaust clip here slides underneath it. Now I'm going to put the carburetor on, and it's a bit of a pain in the ass. You have to put these bolts here. Let me show you right there. 1 and 2. And you have to put them through the plastic and then through the holes in the carburetor. And it should look like this when you're done, with the primer bulb and the choke facing up and the intake in the lower left of that box. And then you have to take this heat shield / gasket and slide that on the back, and I'll show you what that looks like all together. Okay, now with the gasket on, it looks like this from the front, and from the back, there you have it. You have the 2 bolts sticking through, and then the little piece of the carburetor where the cable attaches comes right out through that little slot there. So the next step is to put this little end of the throttle cable through this little hole on the back of the little handle that controls the throttle plate, and then screw it all right back onto the heat dam here. So this is how it looks all put back together. Okay. You can see the throttle line coming in here, then going into the hole, and now I know it's all working because when I push the trigger I can see the throttle line pulling on that throttle handle and opening it up. Now I screwed this metal plate back on to the intake. I'm not sure what its purpose is, but it was on there when I took it apart, so I put it back. Now I'm going to take this fuel line, and this is the main fuel line. It runs all the way to the bottom of this tank, and it has a little filter on the end of it, and you slide that behind the plate by the carburetor, so I just kind of shove it back there, and then it attaches back here on the bottom of the carburetor to that little brass tube right there. So I'll show you what that looks like all attached in just a second. There it is, attached to the little copper inlet pipe. It was a little bit of a pain to get it on there, and you can do that as you're putting the carburetor on if you want. I just find that I'm holding so many things in place when I'm trying to get that carburetor on. This was one less thing, and I would have rather wrestled with it at the end like I did. Now, this little piece of fuel line here that's coming, oh, let's see here, it's coming out of the front side of the primer bulb, and then it leads over here and it just terminates, and that actually slides into this hole here. It goes right in here. That is the fuel return. So this one's already been cut and tapered so that it slides into here easily. So it pulls in and out real easy. So I'll just work that back into there, and that's where that goes, and now the carburetor will be fully hooked up again. Now I've placed this whole engine assembly back onto the backpack frame. I have the little blower piece here all hooked back on. That just slides over there, and then there's a little screw to help it clamp. That's easy. And now I'm going to put the cover on and then put the 3 screws in the bottom that hold the whole assembly onto the frame. One thing that I wanted to point out real quick was that on the back side of the carburetor there are these 2 little round things, and those are actually screws, and they take a special tool. But those are the carburetor adjusting screws, and there are lots of videos on how to adjust a carburetor on a small 2-cycle engine like this. The carburetor kit that I had bought for this engine actually came with a little tool to adjust those. So I'm not going to get into that in this video, but I might do it in a later video. But there are many videos out there on YouTube on how to do this. So to put the cover back on, it just slides over the whole top of the engine assembly, like so. Sorry, the lighting is terrible. But anyway, it slides over the top like that, and then there's a screw in the front, a screw in the front right corner, and then a screw here, and a screw here. And I just put the screws in before I even get the cover settled on over that thing. But the reason that I don't tighten the motor down to the frame until after I put the cover on is because you can't really reach those back bolts. So don't get ahead of yourself and attach or screw the engine to the backpack frame until after you've put this cover on. And even with the cover on, you can still reach the carburetor adjustment screws when you're ready to do that. Okay, so I was able to wiggle that engine around enough that I could reach all the screws on this, even the ones in the back. It's all tightened on there. Now the next thing I'm going to do is on the bottom there's 3 screws that go through these 3 springs and then into the plastic casing of the blower assembly. And I'm just going to kind of flip this thing over. You may want to make sure your fuel is drained for this because you don't want it to drip out or anything. And put those screws in. It's not exactly easy. You just got to keep messing with it until you finally get them in there. So I'm going to go off camera and do that. You wouldn't want to watch me do it anyway because it's a bit of a struggle. This part will probably take me 10 minutes. Finally have this thing put together. Getting this engine attached back to the backpack frame was a serious pain in the ass. I managed to spill gas on myself even though there was only a little bit in there and ruin a pair of good pants. And why would I be wearing good pants when working on a leaf blower? Well, let's just say that my superpower is hindsight. But in any case, it's all put back together. I would imagine that it will work fine. And I'll put an update video on here when I first start it up. Hopefully all is well. Oh, I almost forgot. The very last step is putting the air filter on. So the air filter goes in there. This one's a little bit oily, but otherwise it's pretty clean. Then the cap goes on like that, and a screw on each side, and that's all done. And the only other thing I have to do is screw the spark plug back in and put the wire back on it, and it should be ready to start. Thank you for watching. Just a quick update before I close this video for good. I ran outside and tested it. I still have to adjust the carburetor, but it did start right up, so all is well. I think I ended up putting about $120 or $130 into this. I paid about $30 for the machine not running, but of course I didn't realize at that time that this had that problem with the piston rings getting stuck. Otherwise I might have rethought that and offered to take it off his hands for free. But in any case, $130 into a leaf blower that is probably about $250 to $300 new, I believe. It's not too bad, so I'll be pretty happy with it.